century project teams should be given this account of just what the Victorians could achieve without computers, emails, computer-aided drawing, even without tower cranes, it turns out.
Jim, there's some feedback coming through. Every time you see it, I can hear you being fed back.
Sorry?
It's feedback.
Dan, we seem to be having a feedback. Yeah, okay, so I believe that this was the largest building the world had ever seen, and it was completed in under a year and delivered on time, actually under a year, just under, and on budget. In 5 months, it made 110% of its cost as a profit, which some folks still benefit from today. It attracted a quarter of the UK population at that time, showcased both British and international industry, while also letting people experience the benefits of water closets in public buildings and homes, because until then there were virtually no water closets. There was a slight problem, and people actually were so enamoured of the water closet, they spent all their time playing with them instead of moving on and let somebody else use them. Both my grandparents were Victorians, yet how well do we know them? Were they this prissy, seeing this advertisement for Beecham's Pills? Or might they have been a bit more down to earth? I don't think they would have been quite as far down to earth as this advert for Bovril, which you certainly would never be able to use today. And of course the process had never tried that in the first place. Try using an image of royalty in your advertisements today, and you might very well finish up in the Tower, but the Victorians apparently could manage it. Queen Victoria may not have been amused by that particular point, and you could even have finished up at the Tower. But as with our recent Queen, there are plenty of shots, photographs of Victoria being highly amused by various things. And just as a side issue, there is this portrait of Queen Victoria, which she had commissioned to hang in Prince Albert's dressing room. And when you see that, you do wonder, yes, they did only have 9 children. Let's move back to Crystal Palace and the lead up to the project. Prince Albert was a minor German prince and a cousin of Queen Victoria's. Both were born in 1820. 3 years after she came to the throne, they were married on the 10th of February 1840. But many folks were devastated that their beautiful young queen had married a German, forgetting, of course, that she was herself half German. He spent years trying to fit into British society and set out to get involved whenever possible. Many organisations invited him to join them, and he became the president of the Society of Arts in 1843 with the intention of becoming more involved. He was aware that in Germany there was more emphasis on technical education than in Britain, so such societies were important in the pressures that they could exert on politicians and society at large. Another person involved was Henry Cole. He had joined the civil service and worked in the patent office, and then with Rowland Hill was introducing the penny post service in 1840. He became actively involved in promoting rail services to the public. And in 1846, he joined the Society of Arts and immediately worked on ideas for exhibitions promoting many industrial products and processes. The Society of Arts offered prizes for the Society's public exhibitions starting in 1847, with ones in 1848 and 1849, and you can see how the attendance was growing. Both Henry Cole and Prince Albert and others pressed for a much bigger exhibition, suggesting 1851. They were certainly aiming big. This somewhat ad hoc committee was established to promote the idea and move forward rapidly to get a working group set up. And in a meeting in June 1849, they really got carried away with a really grand plan with less than 2 years to achieve not just a large exhibition, but an international one, and thus British industry could not just show its products, but they could be compared with those from other countries. A really grand plan, not just a larger attendance, but an exhibition large enough to hold them in a building long enough to hold their attention. At this point, they realised that there was no single building in the UK was large enough to accommodate their scheme. So they looked for a site large enough for a suitable, even if temporary, building to suit. Architects were asked to submit plans and estimates for a building big enough for the whole thing. There was a space in Hyde Park, but would the Royal Parks let them use such a large space? No doubt, with Prince Albert on the committee and other great and good, there was enough pressure on the Royal Parks to agree to a temporary building. It had to be removed within 3 years. Many influential people were totally against the scheme and to snap at the heels of the organisers for the next 2 years. No public money was the demand, so the whole thing was to be funded by a public appeal, which actually worked with companies, firms and individuals chipping in. A Royal Commission was established for the project to give accountability and to control some of the enthusiasm. Time really was getting a bit close. So they rejected all the architect schemes that had been put in. Meanwhile, fundraising was getting underway with 300 or more committees around the country organising interest in the exhibition and drumming up support from people with a view to them going to see it. And it included posh do's like this one. Publicity was important, and this is a reproportioned illustration of a banquet at the Mansion House in London in March 1850, just 14 months before the exhibition was to open. The building committee set a subcommittee to come up with their own design. And these were them. How many of us have had to deal with committees where the members kept having bright ideas which wasted time and blunted enthusiasm? I.K. Brunel was brilliant in so many ways, but in others he was just too enthusiastic, until the Great Western Railway and his big ships. Unlike those, he really needed some assistant to squash his silly ideas. In this case, he was allowed to push a great grand design. The committee proposal had a dome which challenged St. Peter's in Rome, and the number of bricks for the building would challenge the country's brick industry. It received public derision and jeopardized the whole project. The committee were quite panicky, but then a suitable solution rode into view. Joseph Paxton, from a poor family in Bedfordshire, was apprenticed as a gardener at 14 years old. However, he showed such promise that aged 22, the Duke of Devonshire appointed him as head gardener at Chatsworth. Paxton introduced many innovations at Chatsworth, including the Emperor Fountain, a 290-foot high fountain. Water supply under pressure to that from a reservoir well up in the hills nearby. In 1840, he designed an enormous iron and glass tropical hothouse, which was large enough for Queen Victoria's carriage to drive through on a visit in 1843. Paxton advanced professionally at great speed through the 1840s, including many appointments, including director of the Midland Railway Company. In London, for a railway board meeting in 1850, he visited the newly built House of Commons with an MP because they had terrible acoustic problems there. You couldn't even hear the politicians properly, never mind what they were saying. And he had some forthright comments about design by committees. He said he had heard about the exhibition committee and that they were also in trouble, and mentioned he had some ideas which might help. Oh, bother. Sorry, folks. This is the famous sketch on his blotting paper from the Midland Board meeting. It's based on his great hothouse design, but for a building 25 times as big. Because his proposal was for a building of 19 acres with also a mezzanine that, depending on which account you take, was from 7 acres or rather more. By this time, some exhibits, of course, from around the world had already been dispatched by land and sea, so there was a lot of a worry as to just what was going to happen if the stuff turned up and they hadn't anywhere to put it. Cole had already spoken to Fox and Henderson, major civil engineering company, contractors with works in Birmingham. Paxton had spoken to chances in Smethwick about the glass sheet needed for the building, and they were told to crack on. Just look at the dates of how this project was going. Just 9 months from on-site to opening, and filled with thousands of exhibits, eventually 100,000 exhibits from the UK and around the world. Paxton's original design was to be 1,851 feet in length, matching the date, 400 feet in width, and with a footprint of 19 acres. The statistics of the building are mind-blowing and induce brain fade and calculator fatigue when you get into it. Research produced various data, but along with my best efforts, there was something like 1,460 columns in the building, ranging from 24 to 48 to 72 foot high. These would be joining 2,300 girders supporting the floors and the roof, with some 295,000 panes of glass. These panes of glass which were flattened out, rolled, like blown tubes, because that was the only way they could get large quantities of flat glass quickly. But they were some 4.5 foot long by just 10 inches wide. A million square feet of glass. There would be 24 miles of gutters to collect rainwater off the roof, and 7.5 miles of drains on the ground to take that away, probably into the Serpentine. The building would be on the south side of Hyde Park, near where I lived for 3 years in my years of study at Imperial College. The park had a lot of trees, and while the small ones could be quietly removed, there were many larger trees and 3 very large elms in the line across the building. So a transept rising to 108 foot in height was added. Every time I put a building of the Crystal Palace footprint on a map near where I'm giving this lecture, I have real doubts about whether it really was that big. And I think it was. So here we have one from this building, Millennium Point. If you start at the nearer column of there and go out of city, you go past the next 3 buildings, part of the University of Central England, then go across some open ground. You then go past the halls of residence that the university have built. Then you cross the ring road, and finally you get beyond that rather funny tower-shaped public house. As far as the city is concerned, all right, I seem to have lost a slide there. In the city, it was so big it stretched from the far end of the International Convention Centre and the Symphony Hall, past the Rep, past the Library of Birmingham, past Baskerville House and the old Central Library site, the Museum and Art Gallery, plus Paradise Circus. It was that big. So early in 1850, the 26-acre construction site was handed over, and a timber hoarding, as shown here, was erected. Later, these planks would be reused as floorboards in the building, set throughout with a gap between adjacent floorboards, rather like a seaside pier, so best part of an inch between each board. So ladies with long dresses would help by gently sweeping dust until it disappeared through these slots into the underfloor space. And only larger bits of litter actually had to be gathered up. One does fear a little bit about the Bradford football ground fire, but this was a slightly different sort of building. Workshops were set up nearby to machine timber components, such as rebating glazing bars, by the mile. 220 miles of glazing bars. There were cutters which cut the cross-section of the glazing bars and parted them off, all 290,000 of them. The glazing bars were then cut to length. Multi-spindle drilling machines were installed for various components to be finished. Machining 24 miles of guttering for rainwater. And finally, all those timber parts had to be painted. The first columns and girders went up from one end starting in September 1850. The framing was well advanced here by November 1850. It is probable that glazing of the far end of the roof had started, as installing the roofing glass would take several months. All the columns, girders, roofing supports and drains were arriving just in time on the site. There was nowhere to store this sort of materials, so they came down by rail from the Midlands. They had to be taken by road transport at the Midlands end and at the London end, of course. And just remember the numbers: 1,430 columns linked by 2,300 girders, 3,450 subsidiary girders supporting the flooring, and then there would be cross beams, as the flooring had to span 24 feet, and there were 24 miles of timber gutters supported by 24 miles of 24-foot-long trusses under that roof. What I haven't found is any detail of the supply of the side walls of the building, much of which were also glass. And so there's a similar situation there, but I haven't found any figures for that. The girder supporting the floor had up to 4 at a time supported and jointed off the columns. And there must have been very good control of the dimensions for all these components to ensure no failures in assembly. Now, this was the age when interchangeability of components was only just becoming popular. Often accepted as being first used in gun making. But certainly this seems to have been a major achievement. There doesn't seem to have been very much in the way of failure of components or of the glass sheets that were being used in particular on the roof. There was a lot of concern about many aspects of such a large and innovative building. What if glass panes dropped from the roof onto the public? Might the whole thing fold like a pack of cards? Would the floor support the crowds expected? And here you can see marching and jumping soldiers were used to test the simple structure at ground level. Bear in mind the highest number of visitors recorded in the building was 110,000 on a day, with 92,000 of them in the building at any one time. These people probably only had about 6 square foot each. The columns acted as downpipes for the rainwater from the roof and were connected to the drains by sockets filled with lead. The columns were supported on minimal foundations because of the temporary nature of the building. Although in fact quite a lot of those foundations were left behind when the building was removed after the exhibition, and they do still produce crop marks in very, very dry weather, but not particularly obvious. trees were a problem, with one Member of Parliament in particular, Colonel Charles Sibthorpe, leaping to defend each and every one of them. He was the most active of many criticals of the whole scheme, but without being very well received by the general public. Partly, maybe, because 10 years earlier he managed to reduce Parliament's vote for Prince Albert for his allowance from £50,000 a year to £30,000 a year. His comments on that were not well received, and his comments on the trees and so on in the press caused a good deal of amusement. And by then the public were warming to Prince Albert. Illustrations like this were published showing quite large trees being accommodated within the building. Although apart from the catering areas, it seemed the trees quietly disappeared once interest moved on to other sorts of criticism. The three large trees were accommodated in the transept under a glazed timber roof, which was raised on the 4th of December. And there it is going up. The whole iron frame of the building was completed by the 11th of December. Completing the glazing of the roof and the timber and glass walls continued for a short time before the building was considered weatherproof and internal fittings could proceed. The complete building here, an artist's view of the whole site, it soon became known as the Crystal Palace. It was, of course, effectively all glass on the outside. There was no heating or general lighting in the building, as the public were only going to be in the building during the summer days. This small building, if I can spot it here, down here, that is the boiler house providing steam to the working exhibits, where the exhibitors had requested steam facilities early enough in the fit-out. The roof had a great many of these ridges, each some 7 foot wide, across the width of the building. The valleys were supported on girders, which, as mentioned before, carried timber gutters connected to the further gutters and then to the rainwater downpipes. Many covered glazing carriages like this were used to install the 290,000 panes of glass in the roof. They ran along the timber gutters resting on the girders below. The highest number of panes apparently installed in a shift by the gangs working on this was 18,000 by one team. The panes don't seem to have been sealed to the timber glazing bars on either side. I think that the pitch of the roof was specifically intended to let any leakage through the glazing run down on the inside of the panes rather than drop to the floor. Each timber guttering had on each side not only the centre gutter, but subsidiary gutters to take this leakage that ran down under the panes of glass. There were accounts of leakage managing to drop onto some exhibits and occasional breakage of panes of glass, but the problem doesn't seem to have been very serious. The problem of heat gain on summer days was controlled by canvas blinds drawn across the glass panes. That's 1 million square feet of canvas, all to be controlled by guys clambering around on the roof. Many splendid colour illustrations were published of the finished building, seen here from the south side. At this side, the building was impressive to us, but unbelievably so to people who had not seen it before and hadn't seen buildings of that size. And we are very fortunate that, unlike earlier buildings of interest, photography had got to the stage where photographs could be taken of this building. They needed a very long exposure, known as calotype photographs. You can see here from the illustration that the flags are waving about and therefore quite blurred. Very long exposure. There's no people in sight, and this may possibly be because none of them still long enough to have been captured on the photographic plate. So long as they kept moving across the picture, that would be fine. This is looking along one side, and this is one end of the building. The exhibition opened on the 5th of May, 1851, as intended. It was opened by Queen Victoria. Initially, the public were to be kept out on security grounds. General discord resulted, and the organisers relented. Representatives of the exhibitors, some 14,000 of them, and 1,000 of the people who had already bought first day tickets attended, and no doubt considerable numbers of the great and the good would be there. Right from the start, there have been warnings from critics of the scheme that the whole exhibition would attract undesirables, criminals, and riffraff. Horrible thought. Some gentlemen wrote to the papers advising readers to lock up their silver and their female servants. Some 500 policemen were on duty during the 5 months of the opening. But generally speaking, it seems that the public had really been quite good in policing themselves. There were a lot of them in the building, and anybody misbehaving might be spotted quite quickly. A variety of guides and plans of the building were published. But it was so big that unless you bought the very best editions, you simply can't identify much detail. There were 14,000 exhibitors showing over 100,000 exhibits. British exhibits were mostly on one half of the building, and the international exhibits were in the other half. And if you get hold of the exhibition catalogues, and there are copies around libraries and so on, it's amazing the range and activities that were covered by the exhibits. On this plan, I have marked the public toilets. Public provision for such necessities have been deplorable in the UK up to this time. The British Museum, with thousands of visitors each day, managed with 2 privies in the backyard, not the Crystal Palace. The ones I've blocked in here, the ladies and gents, don't look very big, but each was 48 feet by 24, so you could get quite a number of cubicles in each of those sections of the building. And there was the problem that flushing toilets were quite a novelty and the difficulty of actually persuading people to move on. Most illustrations show relatively few visitors because the illustrators also wanted to show the exhibits themselves. The exceptions were illustrations like this on one of the entrances, which exaggerates the size of the crowd. Although on the best attended days, 110,000 visitors, it must have been pretty crowded. This view of one of the main aisles is typical of many views inside the building which were produced, and these are big illustrations. We have some of them in the museum's library, and they are really quite a size and lots of detail. The artists couldn't, although the artists couldn't really resist the temptation to reproportion, exaggerate the size of the building, but they were kept in control by the first colour-type photographs, which give a better appreciation of the interior, but again, as with long exposures, meant few people appear on the illustrations. But there is one of the colour-types, and again you can see the proportion quite well. So, relatively few interior colour-types because of the light needed to get a decent exposure. On the right illustration here, including one of the Chance Brothers lighthouse optics, like the one downstairs in this building. Note again that few people are shown because of the emphasis on the exhibits. Attendance does seem to add to about a quarter of the population. The first 2 days were for £1 entrance. Saturdays then were 5 shillings, Sundays were closed, Fridays were 2 and 6. Mondays to Thursdays were a shilling entry fee. And although 1 shilling in those days, 1851, was quite a sizable sum compared with average wages, nonetheless, it was vastly less than the cost of going to many public attractions. It was seen as a great bringing together of all classes, and the sort of scenes probably did happen. Unlike those fears about riffraff getting in there does seem to be a good mix. The police on duty were able, using the balconies and so on, to keep an eye on any problem visitors during the day. At night, though, the building was vulnerable. That large perimeter could attract possibility of people breaking in. The most valuable exhibits, the Cullinan diamond and such things, were of course removed to a safe at night. But a lot of other stuff was still there. At night, the police patrolled the whole building, not in their policemen's big boots, but in felt slippers, so that they could creep along and catch up with any intruders or exhibitors who were working late. There's a lovely story of one group who had arranged to stay on to do some work on one of their exhibitions that they could do with just enough light in the building. And as they finished doing the work, and they looked a bit round, and the whole place was deserted, and one or two of them said, you know, have a look round. So they started having a little look round, and then somebody said, it's a bit of a worry, isn't it? Some of this stuff could be stolen. Until one of his mates nudged him and said, have you seen behind? And there was a squad of police in their felt slippers following them through the building. there were exaggerated comments on the effect of the attendance at the exhibition. The Illustrated London News showing the perceived effect on the streets of Manchester on the left and London on the right, which is rather nice. One of the things I like about these sorts of bits of research that I do is what I call the serendipity of research. You never know when you're going to find something useful. Always have your camera with you and a notebook. And the family may find it rather boring, but if you spot something that's to do with your job, you've just got to have a go at it. Around the country, those local committees ensured that railway companies arranged excursions. And here is a handbill pasted to the side of a rather tatty wardrobe in a back corridor of Domain stately home in the Lake District, which we saw when we were up there. Big notice outside saying no cameras. So I went back and got and did actually ask, and yes, of course I could take photographs of it. It's lovely. They were going to be setting out from Carlisle at something ludicrous like 1 in the morning, coming all the way down, picking up at various places, and on into London. This was on Friday night, Saturday morning. It got you down to London with time enough, if you wanted, to go out to Hyde Park, not to go on to the exhibition, because that would cost you quite a bit on a Saturday, but have a look round at the size of the building. You wouldn't realise how big it was once you were inside, because it disappeared out of sight. But if you're wandering around the outside, you really could see what a big building it was. It wasn't open on Sunday, so maybe you went back on the Monday, and so on. Your rail ticket gave you 1 week or 2 weeks in London, and you then went back up in the early hours of Friday, back home. Accommodation for this vast influx of people isn't very well recorded. There was a warehouse that was converted to provide 1,000 beds, bunk beds. But in fact, it made a loss. So much so, in fact, that the organisers had to bail out the company that had established this rooming house. It looks very much as though a lot of people used the more readily available rooming houses in London, listed in popular guides and so on. Just as an aside, in 1964 I was working work experience with a Swiss engineering firm for 2 months. And with a fellow student, we went down to the Swiss National Exposition in Lausanne. And from Bowden, where we were staying, we bought tickets which, much as what happened with the situation in the Great Exhibition, these tickets were a combined rail journey, entrance to the exposition, and a bed for the night in massive dormitories in sports halls at the university, which had been fitted out so that the likes of us could have a good night's sleep. It's an interesting experience and certainly showed what could be achieved in proper organisation. This was the transept looking north with one of those big elm trees in it, the 3 trees that were left, and looking the other way as the 2 other ones, although I have to admit the further one looks to me to be leaning quite horrifyingly. Moving machinery was displayed with steam being supplied to working exhibits, and other sorts of exhibits were then powered. Electrical machines would have their own steam generators by a similar arrangement. is another calotype inside the building of a locomotive on display. Now this really would be a tricky job. Bear in mind the columns here are 24-foot centres and it's a suspended floor. We have a similar situation here where the large exhibits, if you go down to the ground floor, the very largest and heaviest of the exhibits have to have their own foundations that go down on our proper foundations rather than a suspended floor. And simply moving items like that around the place between cast iron columns would be a bit of a worry. So the exhibition had been a great success. And as the autumn came on, of course, they came to the closing ceremony. The public were let into this event, and they came in very large numbers. The great and good on a raised dais, you can see in the centre of this illustration, and the nodules you can see all around, right here, that's people's heads. There are lots and lots of folks there, and there are also folk crowding up on the mezzanine. So a lot of people got into that event. At the back of the Albert Hall, there is this celebratory column with Prince Albert on the top, which was raised to commemorate the success of the exhibition. Albert's name was linked to the success of the exhibition, and his appearance here is just one indication of how he had become established in British society. Such a change from when he arrived to marry Victoria 11 years before. This column is behind the Victoria Albert, the Royal Albert Hall, built in 1860, one of many memorials to Albert after his death in December 1851. The exhibition made a profit of about £74 million in today's money. At least it was when I first wrote this paper. We've gone up a bit since then. You must remember, of course, that land in central London has rocketed in price and in value over the years. By the end of the exhibition, all those who had declared it would be a disaster and that no public money should be put into the project seem to have become as enthusiastic about the exhibition as everybody else. Public fundraising not only paid for the exhibition cost, but with admission charges generated a sum which could be spent initially on buying land for public benefit, and that is the land to the south of the exhibition site. Marked particularly in yellow, that's the museum area. The building, which was in 1862 housed the International Exhibition, is now the site of the Natural History Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, the Geological Museum, all developed on that land, as well as Imperial College, the Royal Albert Hall, and the Imperial Institute, later the Commonwealth Institute, and all grew up using that land. But other bits and pieces were sold off, sold to learned institutions for their headquarters. I used to go in particular to public lectures at the Royal Geographical Society when I was a student there. And these institutions rented land, put up buildings, as their headquarters and education establishments, and also the Royal School of Music. Profits from the sale of that land was then reused, invested to fund the grants and scholarships for students. And certainly at the time I was at university, we still used to see the publicity if we were going on to doing postgraduate work, and we would appreciate a bit of funding. So they make small grants to students, depending on what sort of course they're doing, and continues. So we're still benefiting. The Albert Memorial, which cost about the same as the Crystal Palace building, was inaugurated in 1876. And maybe that's an indication of how Prince Albert had achieved his place in society before he died in 1861. I feel that maybe society was still making amends for their attitude to Prince Albert when he came to the UK to marry Queen Victoria. This is the building which was erected in 1862 for the International Exhibition, a rather similar sort of exhibition but on a slightly smaller scale, and that's where the Natural History Museum now stands. It didn't have the impact of the 1851 exhibition, but it was a major event of similar proportions. I do wonder if Brunel's ideas crept surreptitiously into the design of this 1862 building. It does indeed have domes and things. I just wonder. It's unfortunate that the building became known as the Brompton Boilers because of its fairly austere appearance. But the Crystal Palace was removed under the agreement for the use of the royal parks. It was dismantled, and the components, with many more manufactured, were used to build a new Crystal Palace at Sydenham in South London. It was 25% larger. It had a heating system and a lighting system, and it was established as a very large building for public events, exhibitions and so on. Even then it only took 3 years to construct it, so they were still cracking on a bit with the Victorians. This is a very seriously reproportioned illustration of a Handel festival held there in 1857. But they seem to have got away with this time. But of course the Crystal Palace became a popular venue which lent its name to the football team, the railway station, the local area, the local park, and so on besides. It stood for 80 years before it was burnt down in a disastrous fire in 1936. And the first time I did aspects of this lecture to the Newcomen Society in the old building in Newhall Street, one of our committee volunteered thoughts, as a 5-year-old lad, he had seen the fire, living quite close to that site. And apparently it could be seen from all over London, the red glow, as the Crystal Palace burnt down. The iron framing and glazed building, of course, would be fireproof, but the contents were flammable. Very sad. The destruction was so complete that there was no attempt made to rebuild it. But it had lasted 80 years, not bad for a temporary building. Pretty good, really. The Festival of Britain in 1951 had a reconstruction of a representative section of the 1851 building. And I don't know whether anything happened yet, but certainly years ago there was a very grandiose plan for a full-size replica somewhere in the Middle East. Maybe the current conflict will stop that. But there we are. So I think we need to commemorate the achievements of Victorians in succeeding in under a year in building and fitting out such a large construction, and how they did it. How could they achieve that? Things were different. You didn't need planning permission for the sort of thing you need now. We didn't have regulations limiting heights and so on for construction work. But nonetheless, it was a major achievement. And, of course, the best-known contributors to its success were Prince Albert, Joseph Paxton, and Henry Cole, seen here. But of these, I give the greatest accolade really to Joseph Paxton, a gardener who overcame the bureaucracy and the establishment to raise himself up to being a great achiever in the Victorian age. And I think that's something we should remember. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, as usual, there's an opportunity for questions and comments. For those of you here in the room, I'll like to bring you a roving microphone before you do anything so that everybody else can hear you. For those of you at home, as we're using a Zoom webinar, instead of previous instructions to use the chat function to raise any questions, there is an actual Q&A function. So if you'd like to put any questions or comments into the Q&A facility, then if we have anything interesting, we'll read it out. But there's one over here.
How long did the exhibition last for?
Sorry?
How long did the exhibition go for?
5 months.
5 months, that's all. And how many people actually went? Do we know?
7 million.
7 million, yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? What was the catering like there?
There was a big refreshment area. Actually, that area was the only one where they left the trees intact. The trees went up through the roof, so it produced a nice sort of ambiance for people having their sandwiches or whatever. There certainly was quite a section set aside for catering. I would guess at all stages, all values. No doubt the great and good could get a very, very good meal. But what there was for a lot of the visitors, I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one over here, I think.
Have you any information on how they actually organised the immense number of tasks involved? Because clearly there was an enormous amount of work to be done, and you've listed some of the great and the good that were involved, but were there a multitude of subcommittees around the country?
Oh, around the country, for a lot of it, there were subcommittees, and each subcommittee had a series of objectives. One was to involve the local industry in supporting the exhibition, in proposing exhibits and getting them down there. And another section was concerned with the arrangements for transporting people who wanted to go to the exhibition. And my guess is, depending on where you were, also probably something to augment what the railways were normally doing by way of providing refreshments to people who were travelling. Because if you take those people coming down from Carlisle at 1 in the morning, they were going to get quite hungry by breakfast time. So, yeah, I think there was a lot of activity by the individual committees. And if you get hold of the catalogues of the exhibition, which occupy a foot or more of shelf space, have details not only of the particular exhibits, but of an awful lot of the organisation is listed in there as to how they were doing it.
Very simple question. There seemed to be quite a bit of wood in it from some of the early illustrations that you put up. What sort of wood was it? Do you know? Was it cedar or something like that? Which,
Sorry?
Was it cedar or something like that, which would resist, rotting?
The building, well, a lot of the timber, I mean, the timber was only going to be in use for the year.
Yeah,
So,
I know, but it was there for 80 years. I mean, did they keep replacing it?
No, don't confuse the 1851 building was the one put up as very much as a temporary building for a year's use.
Oh, I see.
Then dismantled. Then they have a lot more columns, and I don't know how much of the existing columns were able to be relocated to Sydenham.
Oh, I see.
And when they went there, it was a proper long-term building project.
Yeah.
Okay, it lasted 80 years, which, given the nature of the building, may have been inevitable. But it was a much better construction,
Right.
quite sure.
Yeah. The other thing was, I seem to get this.
Sorry?
I seem to about 10 or 15 years ago, reading something about the fact that the Chinese were thinking of rebuilding it.
Oh, yeah.
Is that something you recall?
Well, yes, 15, 20 years ago,
Yeah.
there were various schemes floated for a similar exhibition building which was piggybacked on the reputation of the Great Exhibition
Right.
and the Crystal Palace with, again, a building and so on, but I don't think anything's ever come of that.
No.
And in many cases, I don't doubt that the people promoting it would have failed to understand the difficulty of putting that sort of building that was successful in Victorian times into a current context,
Yeah.
where it seems to take years and years and years to get permission for anything. I don't suppose anyone was crawling around Hyde Park looking for newts where the building was going to be put up.
Presumably, if there was some timber used in the reconstructed building at Sydenham, that would have contributed to the fire, probably.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
I think I read somewhere that they sealed the glass there with pitch or something, which again was flammable. And
Yeah, well, that would
yeah,
have added to...
because the
everything.
original one may not have needed glass sealing, but the
Yeah.
later one would have. Jim, we have 3 questions that have come in, which are the first one. Do you know how they managed the gas and water supplies and foul water drains to and from the site of a temporary building in Hyde Park?
Yeah, as far as stormwater is concerned, all the downpipes coupled into sets of pipes, and no doubt went out to the Serpentine.
Yes.
The loos there, together with any effluent problems from the catering, was a separate set of plumbing. And I don't know where those drones went to, but given the nature of the world in the time of Victoria, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to find that they also went out into the Serpentine.
Well, I was going to say, that would have been before Bazalgette and the...
Oh, yeah.
And so things like the Tyburn, which is what the Serpentine is,
Yes.
would have been used as a drain largely between there and the River, so I expect it went into the Tyburn before... The next two sort of go together, I think. Fraser says, was the specific modular design used again at all? And then the next one says, is it true that the Midland Railway Station building at Oxford used patterns from the Crystal Palace for its cast iron framing? I think actually it's London North Western rather than Midland, wasn't it? But,
I don't know. You'd have to do a certain amount of delving to find out. I haven't seen any reference to the things being reused, but the entrepreneurial activities of the Victorians, I wouldn't have been surprised if they had capitalised on it to a certain extent.
It's always said that the London North Western station at Rewley Road in Oxford used the same design system and the interlocking components, but as you said, probably remade specially for it. But that's still standing. It's been moved from Oxford. It's now at Quainton Road. Still there. Because I think it's interesting that cast iron locked together system obviously relied, as you said, very much on good quality matching castings and so on. And when you think that a few years later the Tay Bridge fell down because of the cast iron components not being accurately cast and with bits missing and so on.
And big voids in it.
Yes.
It's certainly a very, very different problem. And the dynamics of a train going across a narrow bridge in Scottish weather, and one of the things caught them out.
Shook itself to bits.
You've only got to look at the effort they obviously made with the Forth Bridge to make darn sure it was going to stay where they put it.
Right, I think that seems to be... Oh, yeah, one more.
Are there any of those, the metal parts of it, are any of those still extant? And can we sort of check what type of...
Sorry?
The metal parts that were used in the building, are any of them still extant anywhere? So as we can check over what they... No,
because apart from anything else, of course, basically anything reclaimable was used at Sydenham, and you wouldn't go for it. You see the sort of inferno they had in 1936, that would have degraded a lot of the metalwork there. So it'd be very silly, I think, to try and take that as an example. You need to go to similar quality, similar date, cast iron from similar companies and test those.
I mean, given the station building was done on the same principle and that's still around, so probably that would be able to be, you can go and look at that. So, yeah. Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. That's been a fascinating look at how the Victorians did things in a rather different way, and in many respects, you could say rather more successful in getting urgent jobs done. I went to school at the foot of Sydenham Hill, and the local pub that I wasn't allowed to go into at the age of 17, but inevitably did, was called the Paxton. I hope it's still there. But it commemorated the designer of the Crystal Palace. I think my late father remembers seeing it burn from Chelsea, I think. So it was visible from quite a long way away. So forget the destruction of it. The great thing was the rapid construction and its great use for its purpose, for showing off the products of the Victorian era. So thank you very much indeed. Let's say thank you in the usual way. Do you have any notices or anything to...
One or two things I'll pop in. First of all, obviously we'd like to hear if you any ideas with some contact details of potential speakers for next season. We'd hope to be able to get it a bit better organised than this one. This has been shambolic. But in particular, get the contact details. I'm seeing one this month, which looks a possibility, and I'll speak to speakers there about it. There's a sheet here for signatures, because in the morning I will take that detail and email it through to the museum, so they know how many people were here this evening and how many following online. Shows its usefulness. So I think those are the obvious things I was going to mention.
Do you want to mention the sad news about Donald Payne and Joan?
Sadly, in the last month or so, we've been notified of 2 deaths of people quite closely involved with the Midland branch. Joan Allen, the widow of John Allen, who was our chairman in the Midland branch for 31 years. He was also a past president in the 1980s of the Newcomen Society. A lot of research on Newcomen and his activities. Joan was 99 when she died. John died a little younger, right in the middle of COVID lockdown. I went to the funeral, but with the restrictions there, it was very, very limited, and the number of friends who could go, you could count on the fingers of one hand. And they turned up in droves last week for Joan's funeral, and it was a great celebration of her support for John over the years. And I was very pleased because her daughter-in-law also gave some detail of her background. We knew she'd been heavily involved in all sorts of things with the churches, with flower arrangement, embroidery, crafts and this sort of thing. That came out, but also going back to when she was working as a tracer in industry, including doing the tracing of the car I used to drive, the Austin Princess, the Wedge. She did the tracing manufacture for that. So I went along representing the Society and the Midland branch to that. Donald Payne, who was a long-term member of this Midland branch, he was on our committee for a long time. He was involved with a lot of other things. He was heavily involved in fundraising for organisations and institutions which were supporting heritage activities. The sort of person you went to because you wanted to get your case across to a lot of the charities supporting heritage activities and so on. He worked closely at Black Country Museum on various projects and used to demonstrate the chain making there for a while. Going back a long way, Don worked with Caggy, the horse-drawn canal contractor, moving stuff around. There's a lovely shot of Donald on a foul day, trudging along, leading the horse, absolutely dejected, with a coal sack turned half inside out over his head and his shoulders. But he was involved in all those sorts of things, and he got a very, very good, down-to-earth, practical understanding of working with some of these industries and so on. He died last week in his middle 80s. And the funeral will be on Monday at 11:30 at Cars Lane Church in Birmingham. And apparently there's going to be some, I don't know how they organise the catering for these things, there's going to be some sort of catering there. And then some of them are then going to adjourn to the Woodman across the road from here, which is where Donald used to come to drink with us after our meetings here for several years. So that's the background to that. And again, I shall be representing the Newcomen Society in the Midland branch. If anybody else wants to come, very pleased to see them. So 11:30, Cars Lane Church, with some refreshments afterwards, and then a quick dip into the Woodman.
Thank you. Right, the next meeting, the last one of the current season, will be on Wednesday the 1st of April, well after 12 noon, so no jokes. Again, subject to be announced, keep your eye on the website, but as I promised before, there's always something interesting at these lectures, and we'll come up with something good for you. 7 p.m. Wednesday the 1st of April. After that, that will be the last of the season, and then we'll reconvene in October with the new season, which is already a bit better planned than this one was, I think. So, thank you very much for attending. There's a donations box, as we said. We want to thank Think Tank once again for these wonderful facilities here, and for Daniel, the technician, who's looked after all the audio-visual stuff for us today. And so I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.